Good afternoon, everybody. This is Pastor Ty. We're here for our next sermon recap, this time on Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. We're going to review the sermon that we had on Sunday, just a couple days ago. And I want to get started by reminding ourselves of what happened the sermon prior. Because in Mark 7, 1 through 23, Jesus suggests a radical reorientation of where defilement comes from. That's what the whole extent of Mark 7, 1 through 23 is you almost have Jesus saying, why are you worried about what you eat? Does what you eat go into your heart? Because the heart is where defilement comes from. What comes out of your heart is what causes defilement. So unless the food hits your heart, then it's not defiling you. And so what Jesus succeeded in doing in Mark 7 through 1 through 23 is in reorientating where defilement comes from. And so in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30, we see Jesus, and this is fascinating. He claims and changes the orientation of defilement. And then Jesus immediately travels to Gentile territory. So this is so fascinating. Jesus leaves the land of the clean. He leaves Israel. He leaves the place where they practice all the biblical purity laws. And he leaves that place to go to the Gentile territory, which you would believe is just crawling with defilement. But he's just told the audience in the section before that defilement comes out of you, not into you. And so the question then is, when Jesus enters Gentile territory, like he will in Mark chapter 7, 24 through 30, the question is, will he find defilement there in what would classically be considered the land of the defiled? The other interesting thing is that this kicks off the beginning of a several verse chunk of Mark where Jesus is in Gentile territory. He's going to sort of go about the various regions of Gentile territory around Israel. And so this is, in an extent, a sort of retreat for him and his disciples, because they really still don't get it. They're still fundamentally lost and not understanding what this is all about. So when Jesus is taking them up into the region of Tyre, they're going on, to an extent, a retreat, time to dig in deep with the disciples, time to give them significant learnings, time to rest, time to get acclimated to what's coming next. And so when you frame up this passage with that in mind, that Jesus and his disciples are retreating from Israel, they're retreating from the land of undefilement, they're coming into the land of defilement, even though Jesus has just reoriented how defilement occurs. You have this fascinating moment. Jesus is in the house, and while he's in the house, he's interrupted by a Syrophoenician woman, so a Gentile. And while she interrupts them, she is pleading that Jesus will expel a demon out of her little daughter. And this is where things get really interesting, because Jesus, who throughout the Gospel of Mark is notorious for his compassion, his immeasurable care for people, the innumerable amount of healings, demon castings, all of the stuff. You get the impression throughout the Gospel of Mark that the gospel writer is getting exhausted trying to describe just how often and how prolific Jesus's healings and exorcisms and the lot have been. And yet in this moment, when this woman interrupts Jesus's time in the house with the disciples and asks for Jesus to do something, Jesus tells her that it is not appropriate for when the children are eating for the dogs to come and eat the children's bread. And so a couple of things are going on here. Number one, what Jesus is essentially saying is, it's not your turn yet. Because the idea here is that the gospel comes first to the children of God, to the Jews, to the Israelites, and then from there it will go out to the whole world. And so Jesus is in effect saying, your time hasn't come yet. My proliferation of the good news to you comes later. Paul actually backs this up in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, where he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of salvation to those who believe, first to the Jew and next to the Greek. And so you get this impression, even in Paul's letters, of this idea that the gospel starts in centrality with Israel and the people of God, and then extends outward from there. And yet you have this paradoxical tension in the gospel where over and over and over again, you actually have Gentiles who are the ones that express great faith. They're the ones who seem to understand and found themselves on this trust in Christ and this confidence in what he can do. And so what's interesting is that Jesus implies that he can't give the children's bread to dogs. And that gets us to a really fascinating word study that came out in this week's past sermon. There are two words in the ancient Greek for dog that make their way into the New Testament. The first one is kuon, and that is the word for like a street dog, like a big, mangy, flea-ridden, unclean, defiled, scavenging street dog, kuon. And that word shows up repeatedly in the New Testament. For instance, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, Jesus actually says, do not give to the dogs, do not give pearls to the swine, right? He actually says this in the Sermon on the Mount. And that word for dog is kuon, this idea of don't give priceless things to the street dogs, right? In Luke chapter 16, verse 21, you have the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And you're told that Lazarus, who sits outside the gates of the rich man's home and just hopes for scraps off the table, even has his sores being licked by these street dogs, the kuons. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 22, Peter is warning of false teachers, and he refers to them as street dogs, kuons. And so throughout the New Testament, especially in a Jewish context, you get this understanding that to be called a dog, to be called a kuon, is meant to be a deeply offensive term. Like if you're calling someone a dog, a kuon, you mean what you're saying. But here's what's fascinating. That word doesn't appear in Mark chapter 7. That word is not what Jesus told the Syrophoenician woman. What Jesus told her was that it would not be appropriate to feed the children's bread to a kunarion. And a kunarion is an entirely different kind of dog than a flea-ridden, mangy, big street dog. A kunarion is a small dog, a lap dog, what in today's society we might even call like a Kardashian purse dog, right? We're talking about a sweet little house dog that is at home sitting underneath the table in the midst of a family meal. Not undefiled, not the same context, not offensive. Now, here's the thing, though, and I mentioned this in my sermon on Sunday. It's still possible that people, even through that word study, are like, yeah, but he still referred to her in reference to a dog, like, and not the children of God. That's still offensive. To which I would say, okay, let's continue to pressure test this and ask ourselves, how does the woman respond? Because it was her who heard Jesus say this. And so surely her reaction matters. And I want us to notice what happens in the text. The first word she gives to him is yes. So she affirms his statement. She doesn't reject it. She doesn't get offended by it. She doesn't push back against what he said. She affirms it. So she says yes, like almost in agreement with him. The second word she says is Lord. Yes, Lord. So she approaches him as Lord, and even in the midst of his assessment of the situation, still calls him Lord. And then she hits Jesus with this beautiful statement of faith where she says, even the dogs underneath the table, even the kunarions under the table receive the scraps from the children. And so it's her way of saying, by your own definitions, by your own assessment, I'm not actually out of line. I'm right where I should be. And surely even I can have a crumb fall to me. And to that, Jesus says, based on your words, based on your logos, based on your faith, your daughter is well, which is really something. And so the way I finished the sermon on Sunday was to say this. Jesus in last week's passage reoriented defilement and said it comes out of you, it doesn't come into you. He then heads out of the undefiled world into the defiled world, out of Israel and into the Gentile country. And the question was, would Jesus find any defilement in the land of the defiled, air quotes? And what he finds in the Syrophoenician woman, and this was the big lesson for the disciples who hopefully were paying attention, is that in the Syrophoenician woman, Jesus sees undefiled faith. Because what comes out of her? What comes out of her when Jesus first responds to her the way that he did? Did immorality come out of her? Did pride come out of her? Did anger come out of her? Did evil thoughts come out of her? Did malice come out of her? Slander come out of her? None of that came out of her. What came out of her? Yes, Lord. And then more faith, even greater faith, even more confidence in what he would do for her. And so the great beauty of undefiled faith is this, friends. Dogs can become children of God. even the Kunarians can become sons and daughters of the King and inheritors of these great gospel promises. And isn't that great news for, I don't know about you, but I'm a Gentile. So for us Gentiles, for those of us who were born into the land of defilement, isn't it great to know that the gospel can impact us and that we can become children of God? But here's the big warning we finished with on Sunday. If Kunarians can become children of God, then children of God can become the street dogs. They can become the Ku-ons. How do I know that's true? Philippians chapter 3, verse 2, the Apostle Paul says something fascinating about the Judaizers. He calls them dogs, and he says that the reason why is because they mutilate the flesh. And so the Judaizers were going around telling saved Christians that unless they got circumcised, they weren't clean. They weren't pure. They weren't saved. And Paul says, no. You need to circumcise your heart to be saved, not your genitalia. You do not need to be circumcised to be saved. You need your heart to be circumcised to be saved. And he calls the Judaizers dogs because they wish to mutilate the flesh. And so what we have here in this text today is this beautiful promise and this beautiful warning that even the Kunarians can become children of God, but the children of God can become the street dogs. And so there's this fascinating interplay going on here. And don't forget, as we close, isn't it beautiful that we're getting to the point in Mark's gospel where Jesus's exorcisms and healings are so often occurring that it's actually an afterthought that Jesus cast a demon out of this little girl from a distance, right? Because we're told the Syrophoenician woman comes home and finds her daughter in bed, laying down, the demon out of her. So Jesus's power is so great that even from a distance, he can do it just with a word spoken. So may all of this be an encouragement to you. We'll be back in a couple of days with our sermon preview for next week. Have a great day.